There we go. Sorry about that little technical glitch there. We had a few things going on. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started now. Sorry about that, but thank you all for joining. Looks like there's quite a few of you on today, which is extremely exciting, and looks like we have a great international contingent also. So yeah, thanks for joining. Today's session will be on Google Sheets for Finance. Andrew, who you see on the screen with myself, also will be kind of running the presentation. First off, appreciate all of you joining, taking time out of your busy days, but also we really appreciate the questions and comments that you had before the presentation. That really helps us shape this presentation to kind of your needs, your asks, and what you're curious about on this specific topic. In terms of today's session, like I mentioned, Andrew will be presenting. He will be running through kind of the session itself. And then during the presentation, if you do have questions, please feel free to add them on YouTube to that right-hand side. We've got a team of experts here on our side to help answer the questions and then provide the answers there on the chat. So with that, Andrew, I'll pass it over to you for a slightly delayed presentation here, but you can take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. It was a lot of fun to read through them and get a sense of where everyone's coming from, what you're interested in. And I've done my best to incorporate those questions into the presentation. And I have a section at the end for stuff that I didn't quite get to in the main body of the presentation. So with that said, let's dive in. So I always like to start with common misconceptions. We work with a lot of organizations who adopt Google Sheets pretty broadly, and then there's always holdouts. They say, well, I can't use Sheets for this reason or that reason. And a lot of times just because they haven't checked in with Sheets recently. Maybe they checked it out a few years ago and decided that's not for me, and they haven't taken the time to reacquaint themselves with Sheets, which is always approving, of course. So the big one, macros and pivot tables. So this is the first thing we hear always is, I can't use Sheets because it doesn't have macros. That's not true. Sheets does have macros. We have both the point and click kind where you can record the screen and start clicking around and have those actions replayed later. Or we have the full IDE and Turing complete code language app script that you can use to automate and to do all sorts of custom functions. We'll talk about that a little later. And then I also want to point out that there is an add-on, a workspace add-on that can help convert VBA, which is the language that Excel macros are written in, into AppScript, which is the Google Sheet language. So we don't have time to demo that today, but just know that that is out there. And so if you have a large body of Excel macro files that you need to convert into Sheets, that can provide some support to you. And then, of course, you can work with our workspace partners who also are experienced in doing that. Next, opening Excel files. So many people work with people outside the organization. Those organizations might be on Excel, and they're thinking, well, how can I be in Sheets if I always have to send these documents over to so-and-so and they're on Excel? It's not going to work. Well, the good news is that you can open Excel files, most Excel files, directly in Sheets. You don't even have to convert it to a Sheets format, although you're welcome to. You can start editing Microsoft format files directly in Google Workspace. So this comes into play not only for working with other people, but also third-party systems, right? So if you're working with some sort of SaaS tool or some database and it can make an Excel export, you can open that up in Sheets. So two things that are important about that, opening Office files. 4, connecting to external data sources. So this is a big thing that Excel users leverage in Excel, is connecting to data sources outside of Excel. So we have all sorts of tools to do that in Sheets. Connected Sheets would be the big one that we just talked about, but there's also JDBC connections, there's REST APIs, there is data feeds, there's RSS feeds. You can put in a website URL and pull tables into Sheets. So if you can dream up a way to do it, Sheets is going to support you in importing data. And last, formulas. So I tried my best to figure out exactly how many formulas are present in Excel. Somewhere in the high 400s, as best I can tell. No promises on that one. Uh, last I checked, Sheets actually had more, slightly more, but it probably depends on the version of Excel you're on. The point is that there are a lot of formulas in Sheets, over 400. Most people are going to find that the formula that they are trying to use is already present in Sheets. And if you don't find that, if you have something that's very bespoke or very related to a field or a discipline that you work in, you can always write your own custom formula and actually share that with your coworkers. So you can write a formula, save it essentially, and then call it from Sheets, and then you can actually import that into other spreadsheets so that your peers can call the same formula. I will say one area that we don't have as many formulas for would be OLAP cubes. And the reason is that Sheets really came along after OLAP cubes had sort of started to fade out of popularity. And the better thing to do if you have that large amount of data that formerly you might analyze with an OLAP cube is definitely to look towards connected sheets to access data directly in a data warehouse. Okay, so this deck that we're going to be going through today kind of tries to cover the life cycle of a data project. So we're going to take you through, how to get data inside of Sheets, how to do your data prep or data munging, then getting to the meat of analyzing that data, and then finally visualizing it and sharing it with your coworkers. So as we go through that journey, hopefully we'll touch on a lot of the big questions that you had, and then at the end we'll wrap up with a little bit of Q&A. So as we mentioned, you can open Office files and Sheets. A little bit more information here. This also includes Word files, PowerPoint files, so anything really in the Office suite, you should be able to open up directly in the Workspace suite. Now, some things are a little tricky, so there are some certain, let's say, animations and slides that Sheets doesn't, or excuse me, that PowerPoint offers that Slides doesn't offer. Little things like that around the edges sometimes will be a little rough, but by and large, you should be able to just open files and use them directly. So another way to get data into Sheets, import range, that's how you link two spreadsheets together. So you can point one cell to the spreadsheet URL in another sheet and pull in a range from that sheet. Import data URL, this is if you have, let's say, a CSV file that can be returned from an HTTP endpoint. And then there's a few more here. So import feed, that's like an RSS feed. Import HTML, you could imagine if you go to a Wikipedia page and it has tables on it, you can actually just select which table you're interested in and then pull that data directly into a sheet. And on the bottom here, some cool Google services, Google Finance, that will let you name a stock ticker. So you can say NASDAQ, Google, or Goog, and it will pull in data as recent as 20 minutes ago. So you can get kind of almost real-time data, and that can go backwards to 30, 40, 50 days ago. So you can do some analysis in that way. Then Google Translate, also pretty cool. This is if you had one row of Spanish, you can convert that without much trouble into English just by using the Google Translate formula. So we can take a look at that later. I actually used that to take a look at some of the questions that were in Spanish that were submitted for this call. So that was a really good use case, and it worked really well. So we mentioned this already. This is the JDBC connection. So that's Java Database Connectivity. Essentially, this is a standard specification for connecting to databases. So a great number of databases will support JDBC connections. So if you need to pull data from a database and you're not sure how to do it, you don't see an integration directly into Sheets, typically you can write your own by using AppScript with the JDBC service. So that's a little bit more technical. Not everyone's going to do that, but the nice thing is you really only have to set that up once, and then you could share that app script around, and other people can do that. So if you can't get connected sheets to work for your use case, you can usually get the direct connection with JDBC to work. Okay, so let's talk about connected sheets. Connected sheets, very important, mostly because scalability is really a big thing. We are always concerned these days of getting more and more data into our sheets and to do that processing. And Google has a new paradigm to support this, which is connected sheets. So we know that companies have more data than ever, but they do struggle to process it intelligently. And one thing that we see often is that the time to insight is really blocked by process bottlenecks. And I'm going to go through the slides a little quickly because we've got a ton of content to get through, but hopefully we can share this deck out later. But this is a common workflow that we see when we talk to our customers. We've got this gentleman in the middle in the blue shirt, and he's making a request to a data practitioner for a report, right? So he needs, let's say, a weekly report about sales numbers, whatever it might be. That data practitioner is going to use SQL or Hadoop or whatever other technology to query the database and pull that data into a report. Then typically they'll share that report back with the business user, and then that business user adds their own analysis on top, charts. Maybe they do a pivot table, but they refine that report into something that they care about, and then they share it with their peers. And so the big process bottleneck here is really that data practitioner, not the person themselves. I'm sure they're great, but the fact that they need to service a whole bunch of business users, and they have specialized knowledge that not everyone else has. So even if you know SQL, you might not have database access. You might not know exactly where the data is stored. So just knowing how to write the query isn't everything. You need to be trained up in where the data lives in your organization, what's appropriate to share, all sorts of stuff that make those data practitioners harder to train up and more of a valued resource, not a valued resource, but a resource that needs to service many more people in the organization. So that is the bottleneck we're trying to get rid of here. So a few other problems. We talked about the bottlenecks. The next one is stale data. So once that report is pulled out of the data source, pulled into that report, and then shared with that business user, that might have taken a couple days. And by the time this is shared around and you're using it to make business decisions, the data may not be fresh, right? The next one, data exfiltration risks. So if you pull all the data out and put it into a report, maybe that's a CSV file, an XLS file, it can be a little hard to keep track of where that data ran off to. So it's outside the database, it's in a flat file, people are emailing that around, they might have it on a USB drive. It can be more of a challenge for the IT and security folks to keep a lid on where that data is shared. And then finally, and this one's a bit more nuanced, inconsistent definitions. So each report, since we have that business user adding their own interpretation on top of it, and even that data practitioner, may be slightly different from similar reports that are created for other parts of the organization. And it can be tricky to know if everyone's using the same parameters to define what they mean. So if you have some metric you're interested in, like operating margins, you might not know exactly what data other people took into account to make that assessment. So Connected Sheets aims to solve all these problems. And the way we do it is by connecting directly to a source database and then letting you use the familiar tools of sheets, so pivot tables, charts, formulas, all that good stuff, to manipulate the data as it's being pulled from the database, right? So you're under the hood, it's writing its own SQL that you don't really have to write, but you will manipulate a sheet and it will translate that into SQL. It will pull the correct data into your sheet. And once that connection is set up, you can essentially refresh it as frequently as you like so that stays, the data is up to date. And since it's in a sheet, you can then share it and take advantage of all the good Google Workspace data governance tools like DLP, trust rules, and that stuff. So ideally, if we're in the connected sheets world, that data practitioner sets up or they can help set up that connection directly to the database, get that business user set up to be self-sufficient, and then they're really out of that loop once they set it up, and the data practitioner, or excuse me, the business user can even borrow the access from the data practitioner. There's something we call delegated access, so that even if they don't have direct access to the database, as long as that data practitioner sets up the connection, everyone can continue to use the sheet as normal. So we'll kind of blaze through these and then we'll get to a demo. So single source of truth, very important. Once you start pulling from a data warehouse, everyone can pull from the same source, and you don't have this report from this week, report from next week, report from the following week. You're always pulling from one place, and that helps everyone get aligned. Probably the biggest benefit is allowing more people who are familiar with how to do pivot tables and VLOOKUPs and all the sort of spreadsheet-based tooling that they're familiar with to apply that to large data sets. So we're talking billions of rows. Up-to-date data, I think we've covered that one. Modeled data, this one really comes into play if you're using Looker. So you can use BigQuery or Looker right now, hopefully more in the future, but Looker provides something called a semantic layer or a semantic model. And that's really separating the business logic from, I would say, the data logic. So we're saying, I want to know, total profit. And then as the business user, all I have to do is kind of reference that value. And then the data professionals can modify the source of that value as needed as the situation changes. And secure collaboration. So this one's really important. I touched on it, but basically getting people away from downloading flat files and attaching them in emails and sending them around, and instead making it easy for your IT professionals to apply DLP, data loss prevention, services on top of sheets. So as you share this sheet, all you need to do is share a link with someone, and then you can provide temporary access. You can limit that access based on what department they're in. You can make sure people can't share it externally, even though they can share it internally. All sorts of great stuff you can do within the Workspace ecosystem. You can make sure that people can't sign in and view this data if they're not in the right geolocation, right? So if they're traveling, they can't access this. If they've left if they've left Europe, they can't access data that's supposed to be staying in Europe. So these kinds of tools, since everything is in Sheets and in Google Workspace, it's going to be much more secure than pulling data out of a database and sort of handing it off to someone and saying, okay, that's yours now. All right, so let's take a quick look at how to do this. And I'm just going to pop over here into Sheets. And hopefully we'll touch on some of the other things as we go through this. So
do you mind zooming in a little bit, Andrew?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
All right. So I went to, let me just do that again. So we're in a sheet. I'm just going to go to data, data connectors, connect to BigQuery. You also see this connect to Looker, but for right now, let's just do BigQuery. And I've got, these are all the BigQuery projects that I have access to. And I'm going to select, in this case, a public data set, but it really could be anything. I now have a choice whether I want to delegate access or not. This is what we were talking about before with that data professional, giving access to a business user. So imagine I have access to this table, but Nick doesn't. And I want to set up a dashboard that Nick can use and share with his peers, but he doesn't have source access to this data. So how are we going to do that? So what I'm going to do is actually allow a delegated connection. And then once I make this connection, if I share this with Nick, Nick will actually, what I'm doing is granting Nick the ability to use my read access to this, or query access to this table. And that way, when he goes to make a pivot table, Sheet says, okay, use Andrew's credentials to make that query. And instead of now giving Nick access to this entire table, this entire data set, there might be other data in there. I'm actually saying, I'm going to give him just access to this subsection because I can customize the query so that in this case, I did sort of a select star to the whole table, but I could maybe select just 3 fields that I know are not sensitive. You get the idea. So delegated access is really cool. Let's get started here. Okay, so what happened? So you may have seen on screen, it said that we connected to 207 million rows here. So way, way more than we could fit in Sheets or Excel. We've got a ton of data in here. And what you're looking at here is a preview. So if you're familiar with using a database, oftentimes there'll be a little preview section. This is maybe selecting the first, I think it's 500 rows, just so you can get a sense of what the data is. But really, you're not going to use this in the same way you would a normal sheet just yet. And because we can't really scroll through 200 million rows, and if we could, it wouldn't really help us anyway. So instead, what we do is you'll see the various things we can do up here on this data set. And so just to do some simple ones, so I'll click on the tips column, and I should say that this data set is a list or a collection of all the taxi rides in Chicago in 2020, I believe. So we'll do column stats. And even though this is 200 million rows, it's just going to take a minute or two to process this. And we'll see we have, what the average is, all the unique values, how many rows are blank, so no tip. And you'll see some, other information here. But you can do that for all the different rows. And let's go ahead and maybe do a function. So I'll click on function, and let's do count if. We can put this in a new sheet. Let's do if tips and I'll put in criteria. So I'm just going to try to count all the rows, or basically all the rides that had a tip of more than $10. And you can see, so we're writing a function just like we would in a normal sheet, except instead of applying this to an array or something else, we're actually applying it to the full data set of 200 million rows. And let's do a few more here. So we'll get all the rows. Apply that. And pretty quickly we can get a percent and say what percentage of all the rows were people that tipped over $10. So you can do many more with that. And of course, if you go back to our sheet here and you look at the functions, there's a subsection of the functions that you can apply to these large data sets. It's about, I don't know how many off the top of my head, but most of the more common functions you can apply. So let's do a chart. I'll do a quick one here. So I'll do a line chart, and let's do sort of a time series here. So this should just be, we're grouping by month, and we're looking at the sum of all the fares that we got. And this is a little wider here. You can see that huge drop in 2020, right when COVID started, which is pretty interesting to see laid out in data there. I'm just going to go to customize this, and maybe I'll add a trend line so we can see what's going on. And it's interesting because it seems like that was where things were headed anyway. But what a shock to the system that was in the start of COVID. And let's just do one more here. We will do a pivot table. I'll throw that in a new sheet as well. Oops. Let's group this by. So I think I've done that right. So we have hours on the left, we have day of the week on the right, and then we have a sum of, or just a count of the unique keys, so how many rides occurred in that time frame. And one thing we can do is go to format, conditional formatting, go to color scale, and we can do sort of a heat map here where white is lower and dark red is higher. And we can kind of quickly get a sense of what hour of the week, what hour do you have the most rides? So obviously, early hours Sunday and Saturday come up. That's when people are leaving the bars. And then we've got this work hours here. So between 5 and 8, people may be leaving work, going to restaurants, who knows. But the really cool thing here, which I hope you're picking up on, is that doing that analysis from the source system. So if I was just looking at this in BigQuery, you'd really have to know your way around SQL to start to get to the kind of analysis that we're seeing here, and probably more importantly here, right? So we'd have to group by and then getting to this data visualization was probably something we couldn't quite do directly in BigQuery. So we'd have to use Data Studio, use some other tool, Looker, a business intelligence tool to make these sorts of visualizations. But if you do this from Sheets, you can handle all the big data immediately. You can use stuff that feels very familiar to you if you're a person who uses spreadsheets, and you can get to the same insights all in a safe environment that someone has set up for you or you've set up for yourself. And then you can go ahead and share this sheet, with whoever you like. And that person, even if they don't have access, can start coming in here, playing around with whatever dashboard you create. And you can make sure that the refresh options for this, you could set this to refresh every day, every hour, to make sure that everyone's looking at up-to-date data that's connected directly to your data warehouse instead of some extract that you pulled 2 weeks ago. All right, so let's press ahead here to our data prep section. So if you've been using connected sheets, you probably won't need to do much in the way of data prep because it will presumably have been done prior to being ingested into BigQuery or your data source. But if not, we've got a couple quick tools here that are hopefully will help you out. So trimming white space, this one's pretty straightforward. You just go to data, trim white space, and it's going to trim leading and trailing white space. Remove duplicates. This one can be very helpful. Same thing, data, remove duplicates. And then next, if you haven't seen this yet, this is really cool. If you go to Smart Cleanup, so again, data, and I think it's cleanup suggestions, it will look for anything that may be wrong with the data. So it's going to use machine learning to figure out, okay, is there inconsistent data? So the example on screen here is sometimes you have United Kingdom and sometimes you have UK. Well, if you try to group by United Kingdom, that's going to be a problem because you're going to leave out, if you did a pivot table, you would leave out UK. So it makes these suggestions, including removing white space, the duplicates we talked about, anomalies in terms of different number formats. So it's pretty cool. It can help kind of do a great first pass at data cleanup. We get this question a fair amount. Some people, it's very important for their workflow, but you can indeed group rows and columns in sheets. So you just select a couple of rows and right click, and you should see the option to group them, and that will allow you to collapse as needed. We have checkboxes, and more recently, we actually have more, we call it Smart Canvas. So you should look forward to more interactive little widgets that you can put into cells. Not sure what I can say right now, so I'll be conservative. You can use those checkboxes to, as well as filters and slicers, to modify charts in real time. So that's gonna be a nice little trick if you're building a dashboard. We talked about macros already, but in Sheets, you can go to Tools, Macros, and Record, or of course you can use AppScript. So if you are in your sheet and you go to extensions, you can create a bound script. So AppScript can be used for all sorts of stuff, but in the context of Sheets, it really is code that is tied to your sheet that sort of runs only in the environment that's associated with your sheet. So under the hood, it's a Google Cloud project, but you don't really have to know that or ever look at that project. But essentially, it has, if you grant it permissions to your sheet, it will be able to pull data from your sheet. You can create custom functions in here. You can do other stuff like, grabbing data and then communicating with other Google sources. So another cool thing you can do is actually add extra menu functions in here. So if you go to Extensions and AppScript, we should be able to see this bound script in here. And right up at the top, you'll see I'm adding a new UI menu called Symbol Tools. So in this sheet, just for comparison, there's nothing over here after extensions and help. But in this sheet where I've used AppScript, you can actually add an extra menu. And I have built a couple functions in here. So I want to send some data to PubSub, or highlighting white space or what have you. So you can use AppScript to sort of do tons of stuff, but really to kind of up-level your sheet so that as you share it with other users, they can input data. You can provide a more structured experience for maybe people who aren't as data savvy as you. There we go, custom menu functions. All right, analyze. So here's the good stuff. So we talked about column stats in the sense of a connected sheet, but you can also do this with any column. So this, we looked at what this can do, but essentially it gives you a good first view into what kind of data you have in your column. Talked about the 400 plus spreadsheet functions. We got many questions about VLOOKUP and XLOOKUP. There's a section on that later, but unless we're talking OLAP cubes, everything you're used to finding in Excel functions, you most likely will find here. So if you actually go to Insert, and function, and you want to kind of browse these. So just to give you an idea, if you go to all, you'll be scrolling here all day. So if you think it's not there just because your assumption is that Sheets doesn't have as many functions, I encourage you to check. Oftentimes these will be very, very similar to Excel functions. For instance, VLOOKUP is nearly identical. Sometimes they'll be a little bit different, but similar enough that someone who's familiar with the other version should be able to pick up on it pretty easily. There's also, I should say, some stuff that we do that Excel doesn't. So we've got some cool ones like Google Finance we talked about. Got that somewhere over here. So I used here the Google Finance feature to take this row of ticker symbols, and you can use Google Finance, grab that ticker symbol, get the price, and you can even get a full array of historical data. So here we've got 30 days worth of data, and then we're using the sparkline function to create a little graph within the cell. So these are special little single cell charts that you can pull up, and we can get a quick understanding of how the stocks are doing. So moving on to named functions. So these are really cool. These are relatively new. The concept here is that you go to, well, we can just take a quick look at it, I guess. We'll go to data and named functions. You can go to add new function. Essentially, you define a function for yourself. You can use argument placeholders. So these are sort of Lambda functions under the hood, if you're familiar with that term. But essentially, you define a function, and then after you save that, you can actually import functions from other sheets. So essentially, if you know that such and such a sheet has a cool function, you can then insert the functions that sheet's defined into your sheet. So, again, if you can't find the function that you need, you could have someone in the organization create it and then use it to your heart's content. I'm sure you've seen this if you've used Sheets for long. Those formula suggestions are always getting better, and they are helping users just to predict what formula they're interested in. I find this is really helpful, especially for sums and averages, like on the little screen here. But keep an eye out for improvements here. So we didn't talk filters yet. So we have filters, filter views, and slicers. So we got a lot of questions about filters and slicers, and we'll kind of go over the broad strokes here. So filters are sort of a more classic or older paradigm. This is where you are, applying a filter to your data, and then it reduces that data based on the rules of your filter. But it changes that content for everybody. So if I'm looking at the sheet and Nick's looking at the sheet and I apply a filter, all that data is going to collapse. If you use a filter view, you can define essentially a filter that's operating just for you. So I can say this is Andrew's filter, Nick can make the Nick filter, and then I can toggle between the Andrew and the Nick filter. And if I turn on the Andrew filter, it does not change the view for somebody else. They have to apply it to the sheet, right? So we're both in the same sheet, but we're looking at different sets of data because of our filter view. And then slicers. So we do have slicers, and these are best used, I think, in dashboards. So imagine you have one tab with data and then another tab that's the dashboard. You can set up your your slicer to make your dashboard only apply to a subset of the data. And you can actually do this with connected sheets as well. So if you have a dashboard associated with a connected sheet, you can use slicers and filters. So pivot tables. We showed a little bit of pivot tables in in the connected sheet section. So I'm going to save this for a little bit later in the presentation if we have time. But as you know, we have them. I would also recommend, if you want to understand the difference between Excel and Sheets pivot tables, there is a great YouTube video that I've come across that I like to share around, because it's someone who puts up side-by-side Excel and Sheets and shows you exactly what the differences are. So pretty interesting to watch that one. I'll send it around after we're done here. Add-ons. So not many people, I would say, are familiar with the concept of Workspace add-ons. So Workspace has a marketplace. That marketplace allows you to install applications into Google Workspace that are add-ons and additions. That also applies to Sheets. So if your admins allow it, you can look for Sheets-specific marketplace tools. I've pulled 4 here that seem to be pretty popular: Awesome Table, Power Tools, Geocode, and OpenSolver. So I don't use Awesome Table myself, so there's some questions about it. So maybe in the chat you can recommend it or say it's not worth it. But these are worth checking out. And also, it's worth checking the add-ons if you're trying to connect to a specific source system and you're not sure if you can do it. Sometimes someone's already built an add-on for that and made it public. So it's always worth checking that before you build your own JDBC connector, for instance. All right, so moving on to visualize, and we'll try to go through these pretty quickly because we're running out on time. So conditional formatting, we saw this a little bit. Very helpful tool for making it easier for you to see comparison values at a glance. Charts, we have a lot of different chart types. I've listed them all here on the left. Most of the kind of standard ones that you're familiar with, we will have, lines, bars, area, etc. Dashboards. So this is more of an advanced use case, I would say. Not everyone is building dashboards, but you definitely can do it in Sheets. You would combine charts generally and slicers to make a nice dashboard. And we'll jump on to the collaboration section. So you're probably aware you can use the Sheets comments. This is going to help people have a discussion about what's going on within the sheet. Action items, you can assign tasks to people. Version history. Now this one, not as many people are taking a look at. You can tell what was changed in the sheet and when, and you can also make named versions of your sheet. You can make up to 100 of those, I believe. So you can kind of revert back to a specific version of your sheet if someone made some changes you weren't familiar with. On that note, we also have protected ranges and sheets. So if you want to share a sheet out with somebody and you don't want them to mess with your data, go ahead and add a protected range, and that will let them view the data, edit other parts of the sheet, but not mess with your special tab. This is something most people don't know about. We have an activity dashboard, so you can see who viewed your sheet and when, and there's a little viewer trend section as well, so you can see how popular your sheet is. I mentioned this briefly, but you can also set expiration on when you share Google Drive files. That includes Sheets. So you can say, I'm going to share this with Nick, but I'm only going to give him access for 15 days. This one's cool too. It's called the Information Rights Management, IRM. This is preventing download, print, and copy. So I can share this sheet with Nick, make him a viewer, and say, you can't even do copy of this data. So you can't pull out the data from my sheet. You can't use the download functionality. I'm not sure if people are still printing spreadsheets anymore, but in the off chance that they might want to do that, they will be prevented from it. This question came up a little bit. This is legacy keyboard shortcuts. So there is a way that you can change the Sheets keyboard shortcuts to the Excel keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. I wanted to pull out some of the most asked questions that we got. Pivot tables. So we talked about these a little bit. We can do a demo. I don't know how necessary that will be, but one thing I really want to get out there is importing pivot tables from Excel. So a few people wrote in and asked, hey, how do I do this? It doesn't seem like it works all the time. And the answer is it works sometimes and it doesn't work other times. If you are trying to import an Excel file and the pivot table is not working, or it looks like it's just a static, it turns it just into the regular data and not a pivot table object, go back to your Excel sheet and use the convert to range option. So this happens specifically when you're using a table in Excel. Sheets does not have a table concept, and so when you do the import, it sort of converts that table into just a normal array of data, and it loses that causes the pivot table to not be recognized. However, if you convert that table to a range, you should be able to import your pivot table without issue. All right, so let's look a little bit at VLOOKUPs and XLOOKUPs. We got a lot of questions about VLOOKUP, and if you're not familiar with it, this is how and why you would use an XLOOKUP. So an XLOOKUP is essentially, it's a newer version of VLOOKUP. So VLOOKUP is vertical lookup. There's also HLOOKUP, which I believe is horizontal lookup. An XLOOKUP is sort of a newfangled version of both of those. The purpose of a VLOOKUP is to take a value from somewhere. So let's say this ID, or well, in this case, we're looking up this email address, and we have an array of data. We're saying, well, find me that email address and then give me a value that is related to it. Now, a vertical lookup had some limitations in that you can only look up from the left. So in this case, we would only be able to look up the employee ID. When you use an XLOOKUP, it's a very similar formula. And what we're really saying is, so look up the value in A2, that's this email address. Look it up in this section. So I think the email address is going to be somewhere in column D. And then return to me whatever value is in this section in column A. And so when we put in, you know, Andy Jackson's email address here, it finds it there, and it will return this value. In the bad old days of VLOOKUP, you'd have to move, if you wanted this ID, you'd have to move it over here to the right in order for that to work. But now that you have XLOOKUP, you can actually go right and left and be a little bit more flexible. So if you're using VLOOKUP, you can continue to use VLOOKUP. We have VLOOKUP, but you should also explore XLOOKUP because it's a little bit more flexible. We also have, so just a similar example here. So we're returning in this one the values from E. And then one thing that may not occur to people is you can actually join two different tables with these XLOOKUPs. So if you have your table over here, someone gives you an email address and they say, I actually want to figure out what their start date was. Well, you have to first look up what's the ID, and then you use the ID to look up the start date. So you can actually combine all of that into sort of a double VLOOKUP, a nested or XLOOKUP in this case, where we're saying, okay, first take this email address, and I think we use Martin Van Buren here, find me this employee ID, and then we're going to use that employee ID to find their birthday or their start date. So this can be very powerful. It's quite similar to a join in SQL. Once you learn really how to use VLOOKUPs and XLOOKUPs, you'll see reasons to use them everywhere. So if you're not familiar with those, just go to YouTube and search for Sheets VLOOKUP, Sheets XLOOKUP, or indeed you can search for Excel lookups as well because they are nearly identical in terms of the formatting here, or the function definition. We talked about this one a little bit, so I'll skip this. And we got a lot of questions about arrays and array functions. So we do have these for sheets. We'll go over to arrays here. So what is an array? It really is just a different way to define data. So we're talking about, rows and columns. So anytime you have a box of data is a good way to think of it. That is probably can be defined as an array. If you want to define one directly, you can actually do this. So let's get rid of this. And if you use brackets, so 1, 2, 3 would be the columns. And then if you do a parentheses, that would be a new row. And of course, I need some columns in here. Excuse me, some commas. And you might be thinking, all right, well, what's the point? Why do I care about doing that? I could have just put the numbers in here. Well, the interesting thing is that you can use some functions, basically, take arrays as an input. So we have this filter function here where I'm saying, okay, here's my array down here, this wine data, and I want to filter all the data, and this is a named range, by the way, which you can also do. So I've defined this named range here, which is really an array, if you think about it, because it's kind of a box of data, and I want to filter it. And so just like if you're using that VLOOKUP, you want a specific value. If you use a filter, maybe there's 10 matches, you need to pull all of them. That's when you would use an array filter. And then probably more interestingly is an array formula, where we're saying, I need to apply this math to an entire column of data or 2 columns of data. So in this case, we're doing total order. So in this table, we've got the price, and we've got the number of bottles that a person bought. So if I wanted to find out the entire order price, normally I might go in and make a subtotal column and then do a sum column at the bottom. But if you get used to using array formulas, you can actually do all of that in one go. And what we're saying really here is this is an array formula, and I'm taking the price column, and I'm taking and multiplying it by the number of bottles column, and then I am wrapping that entire thing in a sum and arriving at my final answer there. So it looks like we are right up the end of time. So I'm going to stop talking and pass the presentation back to Nick. But I hope some of that was helpful. And if it wasn't, let us know. We'll do better next time. But Nick, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. No, really appreciate that. That was very impactful and very informative. As you guys can see, we're sharing some follow-up links here on the right-hand side with some kind of future learning opportunities. We could call it homework if you want it to be, but these are some great resources for you all to kind of further this conversation. So all of these are kind of introductory learning courses, and some of them are a bit more advanced on topics that Andrew mentioned today. So feel free to have fun with those. Also, I'm going to share a feedback form here on the right-hand side in the chat also. If you could fill that out, we would love to hear your feedback on how the session was, other future topics you look forward to hearing about. So feel free to fill that out. If there are any questions we didn't get to today or didn't answer, we will provide a very comprehensive follow-up of this session, both in terms of recording, kind of the content, as well as kind of the Q&A on the Google Cloud community. So make sure you're joining both the Google Cloud community itself, specifically within Customer Connect. You'll see within the Google Cloud community, that's our gated community here, where we can talk about topics like this, ask questions, and stay tuned for future events. Within the Google Cloud community also, you'll see that we do have another event on a topic that Andrew actually mentioned, Smart Canvas, coming up in mid-May. I think it's May 15th. So keep an eye out for that. The session will be very similar to this. But in terms of kind of follow-up, that's it. Thank you, Andrew. That was a great presentation. Hopefully you all have some great takeaways kind of about the power of Sheets for Finance, and hopefully you can evolve some of your use cases going forward. So yeah, that's it for today's session. Feel free to comment on the community, ask any questions. Would love your feedback on that feedback form. And then, yeah, have fun with those other learning opportunities. Great way for you to go point and click, play around with some of the functionality kind of on a guided journey. So that's it for today's session. Again, thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for joining and or watching this recorded, and look forward to kind of the next set of these events, as well as kind of further follow up on Sheets for Finance on the community.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Have a good one.